Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Here on this channel and on Generation Tech, we've done a lot of different videos where we analyze the major battles within different sci-fi franchises. But one of those things that keeps on popping up is a strange reliance on close melee combat. I say strange because this isn't what you would normally expect in science fiction. Generally, these worlds we cover are far more advanced than our own, which means weapons technology is usually deadlier and more powerful. Now, it's generally accepted that the best strategy in combat, since the first Monkey Man figured out how to beat another Monkey Man down with a club, was to do as much damage as possible to your enemy before they reach you. Early ranged weapons were usually no more than a man throwing a rock, but that quickly evolved into throwing spears, javelins, axes, knives, and all other sorts of things. Eventually, man figured out how to put that rock in an animal sling and arrows and a bow to create an even deadlier weapon. These ranged weapons were important because prior to this, most ranged weapons were basically just powered by a man's arm. A thrown spear or javelin was incredibly deadly, but even on the best days, their killing range was well within 50 meters due to their weight and the general weakness of human beings. And a well-armed infantryman can at best carry a few of these ranged weapons. With a stone sling or a bow and arrow, you had more efficient and accurate power thanks to the elasticity of an animal or plant fiber, which meant smaller munitions could be used to achieve a kill, which also greatly increased the range. Now, we all know how deadly a bow and arrow can be, but don't sleep on a stone in a sling because this can be incredibly dangerous. A few years back, archaeologists unearthed a Roman siege of a hill in Scotland and found hundreds of sling bullets littered across the grounds. These were lemon-sized lead projectiles drilled with holes in them so that they whistled as they flew. They were about 10 times heavier than 9mm bullets and had almost as much stopping power as a .44 Magnum. A trained slinger could hit a lone target about 130 yards away, but these slingers could also fire in volleys and be more effective at even longer ranges. While it might not penetrate someone's leather armor as well as an arrow would, it would cause massive amounts of internal bleeding, and there have been first-hand accounts of soldiers getting their heads blown off by these flying stones.
Mantis, look out!
Now, of course, there were ways to defend yourself from stones and arrows. A simple shield, especially one made out of metal, could do the trick. Special formations like the tortoise or shield wall created overlapping defenses that kept melee fighters relatively safe. Plate armor combined with chainmail would eventually be more common as archers became deadlier. Despite the range of some of these weapons, humans could still cover the ground between them and an archer or a stone slinger pretty quickly. Most fit soldiers at the time could run 100 yards within at least 20 seconds, if not faster. That gives an archer with a lighter bow the opportunity to fire maybe 9 arrows in that time span, with only making a percentage of those arrows stopping or killing an incoming soldier. Then add in mounted warriors, and that 20 seconds to cover 100 yards goes down to 10 seconds, and maybe as fast as 5 seconds if they're already in full stride. This is why archers are almost always going to be protected by fortification or a line of melee soldiers. It's the same thing in science fiction. Sometimes you'll see melee fighting simply because the ranged units couldn't eliminate the enemy because they're way too fast or way too resistant to damage. Such was the case during the Bug Wars. The Arachnids were simply too fast and too powerful for Starship Troopers to stop efficiently with their firearms, especially in the earlier years of the war. During the Battle of Wakanda, we see a similar problem with the Outriders. They were also far too fast and numerous for the Wakandans to stop with their limited range capabilities. In Edge of Tomorrow and The Matrix, we see humanity don giant armored mech suits in order to level the playing field with a physically superior foe. But still, they are incapable of taking out the enemy before they come within melee range. It should still be noted that the defending army in most of these battles are still focused on ranged weapons first. And after encountering devastating losses at close ranges, the side that used the ranged weapons usually adapts their strategy to continue using ranged weapons, but with lower casualty rates. Usually that meant creating more armor or more powerful ranged weapons. The side that was using ranged weapons were usually also humans. These were more intellectual cultures that put a higher value on an individual's life. Cultures with less of a focus on individuals and their worth would be more likely to employ mass wave assaults with poorly equipped soldiers. The Arachnids or machines could afford to lose 90% of their forces as long as victory was achieved. For a human army, such massive casualties would be unacceptable. After a series of battles where you have such high casualties, you would see mass desertion and low morale. Even the poorly armed soldiers of the communist regimes employed in human waves during World War II and the Korean War were armed with some ranged weapons. They weren't just equipped with swords and clubs, although I'm sure their commissars would have been fine with that. Now, as deadly as archers and slingers were for their time, their fire rate and kill rate just wasn't high enough to stop most melee armies advancing against them. Of course, you had moments like the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where King Henry V had a 5-to-1 ratio of archers to melee fighters in his army and absolutely destroyed a heavily armed French melee force that outnumbered his own melee infantry by at least 10 times. But this was really the exception to the rule. It wasn't until gunpowder weapons, especially rapid-fire gunpowder weapons that were efficient enough to fire consistently, took over the battlefield that we saw the disappearance of large formations and large melee battles. Gunpowder weapons simply became too deadly and were impossible to stop. But if all of a sudden you're facing a foe that was bullet resistant or had some kind of armor that was bullet resistant, the balance between ranged weapons and melee weapons would once again become even. The Astra Militarum are a ranged force, but primarily deploy in large, closely grouped formations because their puny lasguns usually aren't enough to stop the most ferocious foes from entering melee combat. This didn't mean the average Imperial Guardsman stood a chance in melee fighting, but at least they were packed together so they would be a little harder to kill. The Adeptus Astartes were much better equipped for melee battles, and their armor and weapons reflected this. As powerful as their bolters were, they knew that they wouldn't be able to stop an entire Tyranid storm with it. When you scale up battles to larger combatants, you run into a similar problem. The Jaegers in Pacific Rim, as powerful as they were, usually had to engage kaijus at close range because their hides and skins were resistant to most ranged weapons. You had to get in close with your fists and melee weapons to pummel them. Actually, that movie's combat made no sense. It was a great movie, but poor example. A better example would be the superheroes we see in the Marvel Universe. Captain America is relatively hard to kill at range thanks to his vibranium shield. The Hulk is all but bulletproof thanks to all of those healthy gamma rays he has inside of him. And for most of these beings, they could actually do much more damage with their fists thanks to their superhuman strength. Now, there were super weapons that could take down these superheroes. For instance, Corvus Glaive, a member of the Black Order, had a glaive that could pierce through any kind of material, including Vision's vibranium composite body. But whatever that blade was made of, most likely it was an incredibly rare material, which meant making it into a blade would be a much better idea than turning it into a one-use projectile. This is why Corvus Glaive was more or less limited to melee fighting, and he didn't have some kind of gun that shot out magical bullets. In other cases, the ineffectiveness of ranged weapons is not due to your opponent's super strength, but due to some other superpower like the Jedi and Sith and other Force users in the Star Wars universe. Due to their precognition abilities, these Force warriors can dodge and even deflect energy rounds shot at them, sometimes turning an enemy's blaster bolt back at them. Then we have more peculiar situations like the Battle of Wakanda, which we mentioned before. We talked about how the Wakandan forces had limited range weapons. This was mainly due to two factors. One, most of the Wakandan infantry weapons we see were created in the same shape and form as traditional African weapons used by the Zulu and also other Central African tribes. Wakanda, as an isolated country and a monarchy at that, was a very traditional place, and their weapons reflected that tradition. They also had much more advanced technology than the outside world and generally looked down on other humans. So the idea that they would copy these lesser cultures and their weapons of war would be a bit silly. And as we said, they definitely had a very elitist and negative view of the rest of the world, especially after seeing two major world wars where humanity almost destroyed themselves. But because of their isolationist policies, they rarely ever had to use their weapons in anger against outside forces. And so despite their advanced technology and very powerful and lethal weapons, the design of these weapons were actually behind the much cruder weapons used by the outside world. During the battle, we can see that Bucky Barnes with a trusty old saw is able to do far more damage than the average Wakandan soldier with their energy beam spears. Sometimes there was just a technological gap between the two sides of a battle, which led to one side using ranged weapons and the other side using melee weapons. As witnessed during the heroic Marines' last stand against the savage blue bestiality-loving monkey aliens in Avatar. Another example would be when Imperial stormtroopers were ambushed by savage Ewoks during the Battle of Endor. Sometimes more primitive combatants with limited capabilities will rely on asymmetrical warfare to even the playing field. A great example of this would be the aliens who could stalk and kill colonial Marines with great efficiency. But it wasn't just the individuals who were fighting that affected what kind of weapons were being used. Sometimes the medium in which the battle was being fought in would change the weapons as well. In our video analyzing the Battle of the Trench and Aquaman, we broke down why both sides closed within melee fighting distances despite having long-range weapons. We found that most projectiles, both energy rounds or kinetic rounds, struggled to carve through water. Bullets immediately stop when they travel through liquid. Only specially created rounds were capable of propelling themselves through water, and energy rounds usually cooled very quickly due to the thermodynamic qualities of water. So as you can see, there are plenty of different reasons to use melee weapons despite having very advanced technology. The reason why this looks strange to us is because we're using the rules of modern combat that we're used to judge everything else. In our world, gunpowder weapons are far more capable than our defensive options, although that's catching up. But no matter what world we're in, it usually comes down to the power balance between the strength and efficiency of weapons versus the strength and efficiency of defenses. But there are also other underlying factors as well. But that's where you guys come in. Let me know in the comment section below what I've missed. Also, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.